By the late 1970s, the Cold War was no longer defined by front lines or battlefield maps. It did not announce itself with air raid sirens or columns of tanks crossing borders. Instead, it unfolded quietly inside cities that appeared peaceful, stable, and familiar. For most Americans, the Cold War existed as headlines and television footage, missile tests, diplomatic tensions, proxy conflicts in distant countries. It was something discussed over dinner, argued about on talk shows, and then set aside as daily life resumed. But beneath that surface, another conflict was being fought, one that relied not on firepower, but on time, not on force, but on blending so completely that no one thought to look. This hidden conflict was intelligence warfare, and at its center was a strategy that American counterintelligence feared more than any other: the long-term sleeper agent. Unlike diplomats or intelligence officers operating under official cover, sleeper agents lived without protection. They did not work in embassies. They did not enjoy immunity. They did not announce their presence to anyone. They arrived quietly under carefully constructed identities, and they stayed. Some would live for years without ever receiving a single direct order. Others would wait decades, building lives that appeared entirely ordinary until the moment they were activated. Their value did not come from dramatic acts, but from endurance. They blended into society so completely that even their neighbors would have no reason to suspect them. They worked common jobs, paid rent, attended social events, and formed friendships that appeared entirely ordinary. And in doing so, they gathered something more valuable than classified documents. They gathered trust. By the 1970s, American intelligence agencies understood that the greatest danger no longer came from obvious infiltration. It came from people who did not look dangerous at all, people who seemed unremarkable, predictable, and safe. This was the era when intelligence services on both sides shifted focus away from short-term espionage and toward deep cover operations. The goal was not immediate access, but long-term positioning. A sleeper agent might not steal secrets directly. Instead, they would observe, listen, map relationships, identify potential vulnerabilities. They learned who talked freely, who complained about their government, who felt overlooked, who felt resentful, who felt ambitious, information that could later be exploited quietly and efficiently. This strategy required extraordinary discipline. Sleeper agents were trained to suppress impatience, to resist emotional attachments, and to accept years of apparent stagnation as part of their mission. They were taught to live convincingly normal lives, knowing that success depended on never drawing attention. This made them uniquely difficult to detect. By the end of the 1970s, intelligence officials privately acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. If sleeper agents were operating successfully, it was because they did not need to do anything dramatic at all. They only needed to remain invisible. Nowhere offered better cover for such invisibility than large American cities. New York City, in particular, was ideal. Millions of residents, constant movement, cultural diversity, transient populations. People came and went without explanation, and few asked questions. In neighborhoods filled with professionals, artists, immigrants, and long-term residents, anonymity was normal. Privacy was expected. Personal history was rarely scrutinized.
In this environment, someone with a convincing accent, a plausible occupation, and disciplined habits could disappear into the background with ease. A translator, a consultant, a freelance professional. These roles raised no suspicion. They required no fixed workplace. They justified irregular schedules and minimal documentation. They explained limited social circles. For American counterintelligence, this created a paradox. The more perfectly a sleeper agent blended in, the less likely they were to leave detectable traces. There would be no obvious crimes, no intercepted communications, no sudden movements of classified material. Detection often depended on small inconsistencies, patterns that felt slightly off but difficult to articulate. And those inconsistencies were rarely discovered by intelligence agencies first. They were noticed by ordinary people: a landlord who observed strange comings and goings, a neighbor who noticed routines that never varied, a coworker who sensed that someone asked too many questions while revealing too little about themselves. In most cases, these observations went unreported. People doubted their instincts. They assumed there were innocent explanations. After all, suspicion itself carried a stigma. The memory of earlier decades, when fear had led to false accusations and social damage, lingered in the background. Americans were cautious about labeling others as threats. This reluctance was something sleeper agents relied upon. They understood that trust, once established, created a powerful shield. People did not want to believe that someone familiar could be dangerous. They preferred comfortable explanations to unsettling ones. And so the hidden war continued, not through open confrontation, but through silence. While governments negotiated arms treaties and spoke of détente, intelligence services on both sides quietly expanded their networks. They prepared for a future that might never arrive, but which they could not afford to be unready for. The success of this strategy depended on a simple assumption: that ordinary citizens would never imagine themselves as participants in such a conflict. They would go to work, raise families, build small businesses, trust the people around them. And in most cases, that assumption was correct. Very few people ever encountered the hidden war directly. Fewer still recognized it for what it was. But occasionally, the careful balance failed. A routine moment would break the illusion. A detail would appear out of place, and someone who had never intended to be part of history would find themselves standing at the edge of something far larger than their own life. This is one of those stories, not about an intelligence officer or a government insider, but about an ordinary woman living an ordinary life who noticed something she could not ignore, and by doing so, stepped into the invisible war of the Cold War. Before the Cold War entered her life, Margaret Sullivan believed in routines, not in the abstract sense, but in the quiet, practical way routines structured her days. She woke early, often before the city fully stirred. She drank her coffee at the small kitchen table by the window, listening to the distant sound of traffic as Manhattan shook itself awake. Her life, by any historical measure, was unremarkable, and that was precisely the point. Margaret had turned 40 in the spring of 1975, a birthday marked less by celebration than by transition. Her marriage had ended quietly, without scandal, without dramatic confrontation. Her husband, a stockbroker whose career was rising just as their relationship was unraveling, had moved on with an efficiency that left little room for negotiation. Margaret did not dwell on the divorce in public. She had learned, like many women of her generation, to absorb disappointment privately and continue forward. What she did instead was open a hair salon. The space she rented sat on West 72nd Street, a narrow storefront wedged between businesses that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The rent was manageable, the foot traffic was steady. The neighborhood offered a mix of familiarity and anonymity that felt right. She named the salon Silk and Scissors. It was not a name designed to attract attention. It suggested care, softness, and precision, qualities Margaret valued more than ambition. She decorated the salon herself, choosing cream-colored wallpaper and mirrors with ornate gold frames that made the small space feel warmer than it was. 3 chairs stood in a neat row, upholstered in pale blue vinyl that she wiped down carefully at the end of each day. The bell above the door chimed when customers entered, a sound that quickly became the punctuation mark of her working life. Margaret liked knowing who would walk through that door. Over time, she learned the rhythms of her clients: who arrived early, who was always late, who talked constantly, who sat in silence, eyes fixed on their reflection. The salon was not just a place where hair was cut. It was a space of quiet disclosure. People talked while looking at themselves in the mirror, saying things they might not say elsewhere. They spoke about marriages, frustrations, children, ambitions. They spoke because the setting encouraged it, and because Margaret listened without judgment. She did not consider herself particularly insightful. She simply paid attention. Outside the salon, her world remained small and contained. She lived in a modest apartment. She worried about expenses. She sent money to her daughter, Amanda, who was studying art history at Barnard College and spoke excitedly about museums and lectures Margaret barely understood. Margaret's concerns were practical, not ideological. She thought about whether the salon would survive another year. She thought about whether she should start dating again. She thought about whether she had made the right decisions. She did not think about espionage. The Cold War, to Margaret, was background noise, something discussed on the evening news while she prepared dinner, something that happened elsewhere, involving people who were trained, informed, and powerful.
She did not imagine it intersecting with her life. Her days followed a pattern, appointments scheduled weeks in advance, regular clients who preferred the same style every time, occasional walk-ins who disrupted the flow, but rarely enough to cause stress. Margaret took pride in being dependable. She opened the salon on time, she remembered preferences, she noticed changes. This attentiveness, which she viewed as professional courtesy, would later take on a different meaning, but at the time it was simply how she worked. The neighborhood itself reinforced the sense of stability. Families had lived there for generations. Elderly residents greeted one another on the sidewalk. Young professionals moved in and out, but left little trace. There was a collective assumption that life, while sometimes difficult, followed understandable rules. Margaret trusted those rules. She trusted that people were who they said they were, that relationships, even casual ones, were built on mutual honesty, that danger announced itself clearly rather than hiding by familiar faces. Nothing in her experience suggested otherwise. She had never been asked to question a person's identity, never been trained to recognize deception, never been forced to consider the possibility that someone might be living an entirely fabricated life. Her strength, such as it was, came from endurance, from consistency, from the ability to keep going even when circumstances were less than ideal. It was not the kind of strength associated with heroism, and yet that same steadiness created a foundation for trust. Clients returned because they felt comfortable in her chair. They returned because Margaret was predictable, calm, and discreet. She did not pry, she did not gossip, she did not dramatize. In the context of intelligence work, these qualities would have been recognized as vulnerabilities, but Margaret did not live in that context. She lived in a world where trust was assumed until broken, and where suspicion was considered impolite. Her life, in short, was the kind of life history rarely pauses to examine, and that invisibility would soon place her directly in the path of a conflict she did not know existed. Because the hidden war of the Cold War did not seek out people like Margaret by accident. It moved through them because they did not expect it. They were not trained to resist it. They were not alert to its presence. They did not see themselves as potential witnesses. They were simply living their lives, and that paradoxically made them valuable. When the woman who called herself Elena Sorensen first stepped through the door of Silk and Scissors, Margaret saw nothing unusual, just another client, another appointment, another ordinary interaction in a life built on ordinary moments. She could not know that this interaction would become the dividing line between the life she understood and the one she would never fully escape. Because at that moment, history had already entered the room. It simply had not announced itself yet.
Elena Sorensen first walked into Silk and Scissors in November of 1975. It was not a dramatic entrance. There was no urgency, no hesitation, no sense of intrusion. She pushed the door open calmly, the bell chiming above her head as it always did, and paused just long enough to take in the room. Margaret noticed her immediately, though she would not have been able to explain why at the time. Elena was tall, with a posture that suggested discipline rather than confidence. Her movements were economical, controlled, as if nothing she did was accidental. She wore a camel-colored coat that looked expensive without drawing attention to itself, and leather gloves she removed carefully, folding them once before placing them into her handbag. She apologized for not having an appointment. Her voice was soft, even, carrying the faintest trace of an accent that was difficult to place. It sounded Canadian, or close enough to be unremarkable, the kind of accent people notice only in passing and quickly forgot. Margaret glanced at her schedule and saw that she had a short opening. Elena smiled, thanked her, and paid in cash. She asked for a simple trim, nothing dramatic, nothing that would stand out. As Margaret worked, she observed without consciously evaluating. It was a habit she had developed over years in the salon. Elena sat very still in the chair, not rigid but composed. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, fingers relaxed, nails short and unpolished. She made conversation easily, but sparingly. She mentioned that she worked as a freelance translator, French and German mostly, occasionally other languages depending on the project. It was the kind of profession that required explanation but discouraged questions. Independent, flexible, difficult to verify. Margaret nodded and continued cutting. When the appointment ended, Elena paid again in cash and left a generous tip. She thanked Margaret, asked about availability in 6 weeks, and departed with the same quiet efficiency she had arrived with. Margaret did not think about her again until Elena returned, precisely on time for her next appointment. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. Elena booked her appointments well in advance. She arrived neither early nor late. She never canceled, she never rescheduled. Her appearance changed only slightly over time. Different coats, different handbags, always practical, always understated.
She never wore jewelry except for a simple gold watch without an inscription. No rings, no necklace, nothing personal enough to invite questions. Her conversations followed a similar structure. She spoke about work, but never about clients. She spoke about living near Columbus Circle, but never about neighbors. She spoke about her childhood in Canada, but without naming specific towns, schools, or memories. Her father, she said once, had been a civil engineer. Her mother had died when she was young. She had no siblings. These details were offered calmly, without hesitation, and never repeated unless prompted. Margaret accepted them without scrutiny. In her experience, people who had suffered loss often avoided specifics. It seemed respectful not to push. Over time, familiarity replaced formality. Alina began asking Margaret questions, not intrusive ones, just enough to signal interest. She asked about the salon, about Amanda, about the neighborhood. She listened attentively, nodding at the right moments, occasionally offering thoughtful comments that suggested empathy rather than curiosity. Margaret found herself relaxing in Alina's presence. There was no drama, no intensity, no emotional demand. Alina was, in many ways, the ideal client, reliable, polite, consistent. If Margaret noticed anything unusual, she dismissed it as personality. Alina never lingered after appointments, never accepted invitations to social events, and never suggested meeting outside the salon except for brief, carefully bounded conversations at a nearby diner. They did not exchange phone calls beyond appointment confirmations. They did not visit each other's homes. Margaret interpreted this as reserve. In the language of espionage, it was discipline. Alina's questions were always balanced by restraint. She learned about Margaret's life without offering equivalent detail about her own. The exchange felt natural, even fair, but it was asymmetrical. Margaret shared freely, Alina revealed selectively. At the time, this imbalance felt harmless. In retrospect, it would take on a very different meaning. Alina's habits were subtle but precise. She rotated handbags frequently, but never carried anything bulky. She dressed in neutral colors that allowed her to blend into any environment. She paid exclusively in cash. Her routines did not fluctuate. Consistency was her signature. For most people, consistency created comfort. For trained operatives, it created control. Margaret did not think in those terms. She saw Alina as a quiet, intelligent woman navigating her life with discretion. By the fall of 1978, nearly 3 years after their first meeting, Margaret considered Alina more than a client. She considered her a friend. Not a close friend in the conventional sense, but someone whose presence felt familiar and dependable, someone she trusted. This trust was not built through intimacy, but through repetition, through hundreds of small, ordinary interactions that never went wrong. That was the brilliance of the cover. Alina did not demand belief, she allowed it to form on its own. And by the time Margaret noticed the gaps in Alina's story, they were already protected by years of habit and assumption. Because deception, when done well, does not feel like deception at all. It feels like normality, and normality is the hardest thing to question.
Margaret could not have known that the woman sitting calmly in her chair was doing exactly what she had been trained to do, living a life that appeared unremarkable, leaving no trace that invited suspicion, becoming a fixed point in someone else's routine. Waiting. For nearly 3 years, nothing happened. That was what made everything that followed so difficult to process. Alina continued to come to Silk & Scissors every 6 weeks, as predictably as the turning of seasons. Winter coats gave way to lighter jackets, summer dresses returned, then disappeared again. Margaret's life shifted in small, ordinary ways. Amanda progressed through college, her interests becoming more defined, her voice on the phone more confident. The salon stabilized financially, though never comfortably. Margaret learned which expenses could be delayed and which could not, and Alina remained unchanged. She did not age in a noticeable way. Her hairstyle stayed within a narrow range of variation. Her demeanor remained calm, contained, almost static. Clients often changed during long periods. They went through phases, breakups, career shifts, health concerns. Alina did not. Her life, as she described it, appeared suspended. She spoke of translation projects that began and ended, but never of deadlines or stress. She mentioned museums she visited, books she read, restaurants she enjoyed, but never companions who joined her. Margaret noticed these absences only in hindsight. At the time, they blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the salon. Alina was not secretive in an obvious way. She did not avoid questions. She simply answered them in a way that discouraged follow-up. When Margaret asked about Canada, Alina spoke of winters, of snow, of moving often. When asked where she lived exactly near Columbus Circle, Alina referenced streets without naming buildings. Everything sounded plausible.
Nothing sounded specific. Margaret's professional instinct told her that some people valued privacy more than others. She respected that. In the salon, she saw patterns in people that others missed. She knew which clients would cancel at the last minute, which ones tipped generously when they felt guilty, which ones talked more when they were anxious. Elena did not fit into any familiar category. She never arrived flustered, never complained, never asked for special accommodations. Her behavior was consistent across moods, across seasons, across years. To Margaret, that steadiness signaled trustworthiness, not control. She did not recognize it as something else. There were small details that felt slightly unusual, but never alarming. Elena rotated handbags regularly, but they were always similar in size and shape. Practical, secure. She paid in cash, even as credit cards became more common. Margaret assumed it was personal preference. Elena's watch never changed. A simple gold piece, unmarked, unadorned. When Margaret complimented it once, Elena smiled and said it was reliable. That was the word she used, reliable. In the mirror, Margaret sometimes caught Elena watching the street outside rather than her own reflection. Her gaze tracked movement with focus, then relaxed again. Margaret assumed she was simply observant or bored. Elena never rushed Margaret, never checked her watch impatiently, never expressed dissatisfaction. She always scheduled her next appointment before leaving, always 6 weeks, always the same day of the week, always the same time. There were no surprises. Over time, Margaret's sense of Elena shifted from curiosity to familiarity. Elena became part of the landscape of the salon, a fixed point in an otherwise fluid environment. That familiarity created comfort. It also created blindness. Margaret began sharing more. She spoke about the challenges of running a small business, about the difficulty of trusting people after divorce, about her worries for Amanda. Elena listened carefully. She asked questions that were neither intrusive nor superficial, questions that encouraged Margaret to continue speaking. Margaret found herself thinking of Elena not as a client, but as a presence that made the workday feel less solitary. Elena reciprocated with small gestures, a recommendation for a book, a restaurant suggestion, a silk scarf at Christmas wrapped neatly with a simple card. To friendship, it read. Margaret kept the scarf in her apartment, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She did not consider the possibility that generosity could be strategic. Their relationship existed almost entirely within boundaries Elena never crossed. They did not attend each other's homes, they did not meet friends together, they did not share extended conversations on the phone. Margaret interpreted this as discretion. She admired it. Only later would she realize how effectively those boundaries protected Elena's life outside the salon from scrutiny. There were no photographs of Elena's family, no casual mentions of old friends, no anecdotes that tied her to a verifiable past. But Margaret did not inventory people's lives. She accepted what was offered. That acceptance was mutual. Elena never challenged Margaret's stories, never questioned inconsistencies, never contradicted her. She created an environment where nothing felt urgent or dangerous. This was not carelessness, it was craft. By the time the fall of 1978 arrived, Elena's presence had become so normal that Margaret barely registered it as noteworthy. She was simply there, and that was the point. Sleeper agents did not succeed by acting. They succeeded by waiting, by making time pass without incident, by allowing others to grow accustomed to their existence, by ensuring that when something finally went wrong, it would feel unthinkable, because nothing, for 3 full years, had ever happened. And when nothing happens long enough, people stop looking. They stop questioning. They stop noticing. Until one moment breaks the pattern. And once broken, it can never be restored.
The day that changed everything did not announce itself. There were no warning signs in the morning. No sense of unease when Margaret unlocked the salon door. No feeling that this Thursday afternoon in late October of 1978 would be any different from the dozens that had come before it. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but had not yet delivered it. Traffic moved steadily outside, and the city sounded exactly as it always did. Elena arrived at 2:30, exactly on time. She wore a dark wool coat and carried her usual handbag, but there is something else with her that Margaret noticed immediately. A leather briefcase. It was not large, but it was rigid and well-worn,
the kind designed to protect its contents rather than carry convenience items. Margaret registered it instinctively, without attaching meaning to it yet. Elena smiled, greeted her warmly, and explained that she had a meeting later that evening. She did not want to return home first. The explanation was smooth, casual, perfectly reasonable. Margaret nodded and led her to the chair. As she draped the cape around Elena's shoulders, she caught a brief flicker in her client's eyes. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. At the time, Margaret could not have described it. Later, she would replay it endlessly. They began as they always did. Shampoo, warm water, the steady rhythm of practiced hands. This was usually the moment when clients relaxed enough to talk freely, when thoughts slipped out unguarded. But that afternoon, Elena was quiet. Her eyes were closed, but her body remained tense. Her breathing was even, controlled, as if she were resting without actually letting go. Margaret wrapped her hair in a towel and guided her back to the chair. As she began to comb through the damp strands, sectioning the hair with precise movements, Elena's handbag slipped. It did not fall slowly. It tipped, struck the edge of the chair, and spilled open onto the black and white tiled floor. The sound was sharp and sudden. Margaret bent instinctively to help. A wallet, a compact mirror, a tube of lipstick, a paperback book with a German title. And then something else, something that did not belong. It was a passport. Not blue, not black, red. The shade was deep and unmistakable, even in the dim afternoon light. Margaret's breath caught in her throat before she had time to think. She glimpsed letters she did not recognize, curved shapes, sharp angles, Cyrillic. Elena moved faster than Margaret had ever seen her move. In one fluid motion, she dropped to her knee, swept the passport from the floor, and closed the handbag with a force that bordered on violent. Their eyes met in the mirror, and in that reflection, something changed. The warmth that had filled Elena's face for 3 years vanished. In its place was something colder, sharper. It was not panic. It was not embarrassment. It was calculation. Margaret felt it immediately, even though she could not have explained why. For a brief, suspended moment, the salon felt unnaturally quiet. The hum of the refrigerator in the back room seemed louder than it should have been. The street noise outside faded into the background. Margaret forced her voice to remain light. "Oh," she said carefully. Elena's expression smoothed into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Yes," she replied evenly. The words were calm, measured, delivered without hesitation. It was a good explanation. Too good. Margaret nodded and returned to her work. Her hands trembled slightly as she resumed cutting. The red color lingered in her mind. She was not an expert on passports, but she remembered reading, somewhere, that Soviet passports were that particular shade. Why would a Canadian translator need one? Why would it be in her handbag? And why had Elena reacted the way she had? Margaret continued on autopilot. She adjusted the length, checked symmetry, styled the hair into the sleek bob Elena preferred. Elena watched her in the mirror without speaking. Her eyes never left Margaret's face. The silence between them had weight now. It pressed against the air, heavy with things unsaid. Margaret felt as though she was being observed in a way she had never experienced before. Not watched casually, but assessed, as if Elena were measuring something. When the haircut was finished, Margaret turned the chair and reached for the mirror to show the back. Elena nodded approvingly. She paid in cash as always, crisp bills counted with mechanical precision. She left her usual generous tip. At the door, she paused. For a moment, Margaret thought she might say something else, offer reassurance, issue a warning. But Elena only smiled. It was a small smile, almost sad. Then she walked out into the gray afternoon. Margaret locked the door behind her and flipped the sign to closed, even though she had 2 more appointments scheduled. Her legs felt weak. She sat in one of the salon chairs and stared at her own reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed unfamiliar. The red passport replayed in her mind. So did the look in Elena's eyes. Margaret understood with a clarity that frightened her, that whatever had just happened could not be undone. She had seen something she was not meant to see. And the most terrifying part was not the possibility that Elena was someone else entirely. It was the realization that for 3 years, she had never questioned the life Elena had presented. Because if Elena was not who she claimed to be, then nothing about their relationship had been accidental. And if that was true,
then Margaret herself might already be part of something she did not understand. The pattern had been broken. Nothing would ever feel normal again.
That night, Margaret could not eat. She sat at the small table in her apartment, a plate of food untouched in front of her, listening to the distant sounds of the city through the open window. Sirens, voices, footsteps on the sidewalk below. Everything sounded normal, and yet nothing felt normal and precise, as if responding to a threat she had already anticipated. Margaret told herself there had to be an explanation, a misunderstanding, a coincidence, a gap in her own knowledge. She reminded herself that she was not an expert on passports, that she had seen only a glimpse, that people traveled for work in ways she did not fully understand. She told herself that suspicions said more about her state of mind than about reality. This reasoning brought no comfort. Instead, it introduced a new fear. What if she was wrong? What if she had misread everything? Margaret had never considered herself paranoid. She prided herself on being grounded, practical, reasonable. The idea that she might be inventing danger unsettled her almost as much as the possibility that the danger was real. She lay awake in bed, replaying the afternoon in slow, relentless detail. The briefcase, the silence during the shampoo, the flicker in Elena's eyes before the handbag fell. Each detail could be innocent on its own. Together they formed a pattern Margaret could not ignore. But pattern recognition, she knew, was dangerous. People saw patterns where none existed all the time. They connected dots that were never meant to be connected. The memory of earlier decades lingered in her mind. Stories of accusations, of lives damaged by suspicion. Margaret did not want to become that person. She asked herself a question she would repeat many times over the following days. What would I say exactly? If she called the authorities, what would she tell them? That a client had dropped a foreign passport? That she had seen letters she did not recognize? That she felt something was wrong? It sounded ridiculous. She imagined the voice on the other end of the line, patient but dismissive. She imagined being told to relax, to stop watching so many movies, to focus on her business. The thought embarrassed her. Margaret went to work the next morning as usual. She unlocked the salon, turned on the lights, prepared her tools. The bell chimed as clients arrived. Life continued, but Margaret felt as though she were observing it from a distance. She watched people more closely than before, not with suspicion, but with a heightened awareness she could not turn off. Every routine now felt fragile. Every assumption felt provisional. She wondered whether Elena was watching her. The idea came unbidden, but once present, it refused to leave. Had Elena noticed her hesitation? Had she sensed the shift in tone, however slight? Margaret examined her own behavior, searching for signs she might have revealed something. Had her voice changed? Had her hands betrayed her fear? The salon, once a place of comfort, now felt exposed. Large windows faced the street. Anyone could look in. Margaret imagined Elena passing by, observing from a distance, evaluating. The fear was subtle but persistent. It did not arrive as panic. It settled as vigilance. Margaret became acutely aware of her routines. She varied her walking routes home, checked her apartment door more than once before going to bed, listened carefully for unfamiliar sounds. She told herself these precautions were unnecessary. She took them anyway. At night, she thought about Amanda. Her daughter lived in a world untouched by any of this, focused on studies, art, ideas. Margaret considered whether to tell her something, anything. She decided against it. There was nothing concrete to share, only uncertainty. And uncertainty, she realized, was corrosive. It ate away at confidence, at trust. Margaret began to understand something she had never appreciated before. Fear was manageable. It announced itself clearly. Doubt did not. Doubt whispered. It questioned perception.
undermined instinct, made action feel reckless, and inaction feel irresponsible. She wondered whether Elena might call. The thought filled her with equal parts dread and relief. If Elena returned to the salon as usual, if nothing seemed different, perhaps that would resolve everything. Perhaps Margaret would realize she had overreacted. Days passed, then weeks. Margaret checked the appointment book more often than necessary. Elena's next visit was scheduled for 3 weeks after the incident. The date sat there, written in neat ink, unchanged. Margaret stared at it often. She imagined different scenarios. Elena never returning. Elena canceling. Elena arriving as if nothing had happened. Each possibility carried its own fear. If Elena disappeared, what would that mean? If she returned, what would Margaret do? As the days passed, Margaret reached a quiet conclusion. Whether she was right or wrong, the doubt itself had already altered her life. She could not unsee what she had seen. She could not unknow what she now suspected. And if there was even a small chance that Elena was something other than she appeared to be, then doing nothing carried its own risk. Margaret had built her life on routine, on trust, on the assumption that ordinary explanations were sufficient. Now she faced a choice that did not fit within that framework. To speak was to risk embarrassment, disbelief, and consequence. To remain silent was to accept the possibility that she was ignoring something dangerous. This was the moment no one prepared her for. Not the moment of discovery, but the moment of decision. And it was in this quiet, uncertain space, where fear and doubt blurred together, that Margaret understood something with chilling clarity. If the hidden war of the Cold War touched ordinary people at all, it did so here, in moments where there were no right answers, only choices that could not be undone. Margaret waited 3 more days before making the call, not because the doubt had eased, but because she needed to be certain that she could live with the consequences of speaking. On the morning she finally picked up the phone, her hands were steady. That surprised her. She dialed the number for the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Manhattan, found printed on a small card she had taken from a government building years earlier and never thought she would use. When the receptionist answered, Margaret did not say the word spy. She did not mention the Soviet Union. She asked carefully whether she could speak with someone about a possible security concern. There was a pause. Then the call was transferred. The man who came on the line did not identify himself by rank or first name, only as Agent Morrison. His voice was calm, professional, and deliberately neutral. Margaret told her story without embellishment. She described the salon, the client, the passport. She described what she had seen, and just as importantly, what she had not. Morrison did not interrupt her. He did not react. When she finished, there was a silence long enough for Margaret to wonder if the line had gone dead. Then Morrison asked his first question. Margaret hesitated. She said. Another pause. Margaret replied. Morrison asked about Elena's accent, her profession, her routines. He asked how long Margaret had known her, how often she visited the salon, whether she had ever mentioned family, friends, or travel plans. The questions were precise, methodical. There was no encouragement, no reassurance. Margaret realized that Morrison was not evaluating Elena. He was evaluating her. This understanding unsettled her more than she expected. The FBI did not treat information as truth. They treated it as raw material. At the end of the call, Morrison said only this. They agreed on a time and place later that afternoon. A coffee shop 6 blocks from the salon. Neutral, public, unremarkable. Margaret arrived early. She chose a table with a clear view of the door and sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she did not drink. When Morrison arrived, he did not look like what Margaret expected. He was in his early 50s, gray at the temples, dressed plainly. Nothing about him suggested authority. That, she would later realize, was intentional. They spoke quietly. Morrison listened again as Margaret repeated her story. This time he interrupted occasionally, to clarify timelines, to confirm sequences. He asked questions that forced Margaret to confront uncertainty. What was clear? What was unclear? What was assumption? Margaret answered as honestly as she could. She did not exaggerate. She did not speculate. She understood now that precision mattered. When she finished, Morrison closed his notebook and looked at her for a long moment. "I understand this was difficult," he said. Margaret nodded. "I understood what was wrong," she said. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "That's part of what we do," he replied. He did not confirm her suspicions. He did not deny them. Instead, he explained the reality of his work. The FBI received tips every day. Most led nowhere. Some were rooted in fear, misunderstanding, or personal conflict. A small number were legitimate. The challenge was separating one from the other without alerting anyone involved. "We need to ensure this is not an incident," Morrison said. He asked Margaret whether Alina was scheduled to return. Margaret told him about the appointment book. Morrison nodded slowly. "We will proceed cautiously." Margaret felt a surge of fear. "We?" she quietly. Morrison did not answer directly. He said, "I will be the one you will be contacting." He explained that the Bureau would conduct discreet background checks. No interviews, no visible surveillance at first. They would look for records, patterns, inconsistencies. If nothing appeared, the matter would end quietly. If something did, they would proceed cautiously. Margaret realized then that calling the FBI had not transferred responsibility away from her. It had bound her to the process. She was no longer simply a witness. She was part of the equation. Before they parted, Margaret gave her a phone number. He said. Margaret took the paper and folded it carefully into her wallet. As Morrison stood to leave, he paused. "Never try to contact Elena directly," he said. Margaret swallowed. "What would you do?" she asked. Morrison met her eyes. "We will see what happens," he said. He left without another word.
Margaret remained seated long after he was gone. The coffee shop buzzed around her, unaware. She understood now that the FBI did not move quickly because they could not afford to. In the world Morrison inhabited, certainty was rare and mistakes were costly. And she understood something else, more unsettling than anything she had felt before. If Elena was what Margaret suspected, then the most dangerous moment had already passed, the moment when she had noticed something. From here on, nothing would be accidental. The weeks that followed were the longest of Margaret's life. Nothing outwardly changed. The salon opened and closed on schedule. Clients came and went. Hair was washed, cut, and styled. But beneath that surface, Margaret lived in a state of constant alertness. She measured her words more carefully than ever before. She watched her own reflection while she worked, searching for signs that her face might betray her thoughts. Agent Morrison called occasionally, always briefly. He never offered reassurance. He never shared conclusions. He asked questions. Had Alina contacted her? Had she mentioned travel? Had she altered her routine in any way? Margaret answered honestly, no, not yet. 3 weeks after the passport incident, the phone rang at the salon. Margaret recognized the voice immediately. Alina sounded exactly as she always had, friendly, unhurried, warm. She asked how Margaret was doing, commented on the weather, requested her usual time slot, Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks since her last appointment. Margaret confirmed it without hesitation. When she hung up, her hand trembled. She called Morrison immediately. "She's coming," he told her. The day of the appointment arrived slowly. Margaret noticed everything. The way the street looked through the window, the sound of footsteps outside, the bell above the door. When it chimed, her heart tightened. Alina stepped inside. She looked unchanged. Her hair had grown slightly longer. She wore a burgundy sweater and black slacks. Her coat was hung neatly on the rack. She smiled. "Hey there," she said. The words were familiar, too familiar. Margaret smiled back and guided her to the chair. As she worked, Margaret became aware of something subtle. Alina was watching her. Not constantly, not obviously, but often enough that Margaret noticed. Their conversation flowed easily. Alina spoke about a translation project involving a German technical manual. She asked about Amanda. She mentioned a planned trip to Boston to visit a museum exhibition. Every detail sounded plausible. Every detail fit the life Alina had described for years. And yet Margaret heard them differently now.
not as conversation, but as performance. She wondered whether Elena sensed the change, whether the tension Margaret felt radiated outward despite her efforts to conceal it. Elena's question seemed slightly sharper, not more intrusive, just more precise. She asked how business was going, whether Margaret had noticed any unusual activity in the neighborhood. Margaret answered carefully, nothing out of the ordinary. As she shampooed Elena's hair, Margaret noticed that her client's body remained tense. Her eyes were closed, but her jaw was set. This time Margaret did not dismiss it. She recognized it. Preparedness. Elena was not relaxed. She was waiting. The haircut ended without incident. Elena paid in cash, left her usual tip. At the door, she paused. For a moment, Margaret thought the silence might break, that Elena might say something that acknowledged what now hung between them. But she did not. She smiled and left. That evening, Morrison called. "Kiernes's discovered entry," he said. Margaret listened, absorbing the information slowly. "Kiernes has a database," Morrison continued. Margaret realized then that Elena did not simply disappear when she left the salon. She moved through a network that Margaret was only beginning to glimpse. The next appointments followed the same pattern. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, but Margaret noticed small deviations. Elena arrived once carrying a different handbag than usual. She mentioned meeting someone at a cafe, then did not elaborate. She seemed more attentive to her surroundings, more alert. Margaret understood the unspoken tension. They were both watching each other. Margaret began to experience the strain physically. Headaches, difficulty sleeping, a constant tightness in her chest. She stopped sharing personal stories. Elena noticed. She did not comment on it, but Margaret could feel the shift. One afternoon, as Margaret adjusted the mirror to show the back of Elena's hair, their eyes met. For just a moment, Elena's expression faltered. It was not fear, it was fatigue. Margaret saw it clearly, the fatigue of someone maintaining a role without rest. The moment passed quickly. Elena smiled, thanked her, and left. That evening, Morrison called. Kiernes's
It required constant vigilance, and it demanded emotional sacrifice. Elena's life, whatever it truly was, allowed no space for authenticity. Margaret wondered whether any part of their friendship had been real, whether Elena felt anything beyond obligation. The question haunted her. As winter approached, Morrison shared more. They had identified several individuals connected to Elena, meetings at cultural events, brief encounters at cafes, exchanges that looked accidental to anyone else. The pattern was emerging. Elena was not an isolated agent. She was a node, a point through which information passed. Margaret felt the weight of this realization. Her salon had been a contact point in a much larger system, a place where information was gathered quietly, without her consent, without her awareness. She had been useful without knowing it. That knowledge cut deeply. The strain of maintaining normalcy grew heavier with each passing week. Margaret knew the operation was nearing its conclusion. She sensed it in Morrison's voice, in the frequency of his calls, in the way he asked more specific questions. And through it all, Elena remained composed, but not untouched. Her precision slipped in small ways. Her answers grew slightly less fluid. Her eyes lingered longer on Margaret's face. They were nearing the end. Both of them knew it, and neither spoke of it. By early January of 1979, the investigation had moved beyond uncertainty. What had begun as a single anomaly in a small hair salon was now taking shape as something far larger, more deliberate, and more dangerous. Agent Morrison no longer spoke in hypotheticals. When he called, his questions were more specific, his tone more focused. They were no longer asking whether Elena was part of something. They were determining how much she was connected to. Margaret sensed the shift immediately. The Bureau did not share details freely, but the rhythm of their inquiries changed. They asked about names, about locations, about patterns of behavior that extended beyond the salon. Margaret answered as best she could, aware that even small observations now carried weight. Morrison explained, cautiously, what they believed they were seeing. Elena's movements were not random. Her meetings were not social coincidences. The bookstore visits, the cafes, the cultural events she attended,
These were not leisure activities. They were contact points. In the world of counterintelligence, nothing important happened in isolation. Sleeper agents rarely worked alone. They formed networks designed to compartmentalize risk. Each person knew only what they needed to know. Each connection appeared innocuous on its own. Taken together, they formed a structure. The Bureau had identified a photographer who crossed paths with Elena several times a month. Their interactions were brief, public, unremarkable. They exchanged newspapers, sometimes books, sometimes nothing at all. To an observer, it looked like coincidence. To trained analysts, it looked like tradecraft. There was also a woman who taught at a community college. She appeared at the same gallery openings and lectures as Elena with suspicious frequency. They rarely spoke for long, but their presence overlapped too consistently to be accidental. Margaret listened as Morrison described these fragments. She realized that Elena's life extended far beyond the narrow outline she had been shown. The quiet translator persona was only one layer. Behind it existed a web of interactions carefully designed to avoid detection. Morrison used a term Margaret had not heard before, illegals. He explained that these were operatives who entered the country without diplomatic cover. They assumed entirely fabricated identities. They lived as citizens, not representatives. Their loyalty was not divided. Their mission was singular. Unlike embassy-based intelligence officers, illegals had no protection if discovered. Their survival depended entirely on their ability to remain invisible.
That invisibility required discipline. No emotional entanglements that could compromise judgment. No impulsive behavior. No deviation from routine. Margaret thought of Elena's watch, her cash payments, her carefully curated stories. It all fit. The Bureau believed Elena was not simply gathering information. She was coordinating it, a node. Information passed through her before moving onward through encrypted communications and indirect channels. Margaret asked how such information was transmitted. Morrison described methods that sounded almost archaic. Shortwave radio transmissions, dead drops, coded messages hidden in plain sight. Technology had advanced, but simplicity remained effective. The goal was not speed, it was reliability. Margaret felt a cold weight settle in her chest. For years she had spoken freely in her salon, about clients, about the neighborhood, about people's habits and frustrations. She had done what hairdressers did, listened. She wondered what Elena had heard, what she had remembered, what she had passed along. Morrison did not offer reassurance. Instead, he emphasized something else. Most of what illegals collect is not classified, he said. It's context, mood, vulnerability. The kind of information that helped intelligence services identify future opportunities, recruitment targets, pressure points. Margaret realized then that she had not been valuable because she had access to secrets. She had been valuable because she had access to people. The investigation accelerated. Surveillance expanded quietly. Multiple field offices became involved. The Bureau wanted to move carefully. Arresting one individual too early risked alerting the others. Networks like this were dismantled only through coordination, simultaneous action. Margaret sensed that time was running out. Elena continued her appointments, though less frequently now. Her demeanor remained composed, but the fatigue Margaret had noticed earlier became more pronounced. She seemed thinner, more guarded. Margaret wondered whether Elena sensed the tightening net, whether she had already begun preparing for disappearance. Morrison warned Margaret to be cautious. People in her position will act if they believe their cover is compromised, he said. That doesn't always mean violence, but it always means self-preservation. Margaret understood. Elena's life had been built for this purpose, to be abandoned if necessary. The thought unsettled her. All those years, all that effort, prepared to vanish without trace. As February approached, Morrison's calls became more frequent. The Bureau was aligning operations across jurisdictions. They were preparing for arrests. Margaret was not told when it would happen. Only that it would. And that once it did, there would be no return to normal. The network that had existed quietly for years, would be exposed. Lives would be unraveled. Margaret felt conflicting emotions. Relief, fear, grief. She had not chosen this role, but she could not step away from it now. The hidden war was about to surface, and when it did, there would be consequences, not just for Elena, but for everyone who had stood unknowingly at the edges of her constructed life. Margaret understood something with painful clarity. Espionage was not about secrets alone. It was about the damage left behind when identities collapsed. And that damage would not be limited to the people being arrested. It would reach outward, to witnesses, to bystanders, to ordinary people who had trusted without knowing. The network was coming into focus, and with it, the end was approaching. The arrests began before dawn. Margaret learned about them the same way most Americans did, through the television. She had just poured herself a cup of coffee when the breaking news interrupted the morning program. Images appeared on the screen, slightly grainy, filmed from a distance. Federal agents, unmarked vehicles, men and women escorted from apartment buildings in handcuffs. The reporter spoke of a major counterintelligence operation, a Soviet spy network. Years in the making. Margaret stood still, coffee cooling in her hands, as the camera lingered briefly on a familiar face. Elena, or rather the woman Margaret had known as Elena. Her hair was shorter now, darker. Her expression was blank, composed, almost distant. She did not resist. She did not look at the cameras. She looked exactly as she had in the salon. Controlled. The name the reporter used was not Elena Sorensen. It was Anna Kovalenko, a Soviet citizen who had entered the United States in 1974 under a false Canadian identity, trained as part of the KGB's illegal residency program. Embedded in American society for years. Margaret sat down slowly. There was no surge of triumph, no sense of victory, only a hollow stillness. Agent Morrison called later that morning. "It's over," he said, but he did not sound relieved. He explained that arrests had taken place simultaneously across multiple locations. New York, other cities, people connected through years of quiet contact. The network had been larger than they initially suspected. Some pleaded guilty quickly. Others remained silent. Anna Kovalenko was charged with espionage and acting as an unregistered foreign agent. The case moved swiftly. There was no spectacle, no dramatic courtroom revelations. Most of the evidence remained classified.
What the public saw was only the surface. Margaret attended one day of the trial. She sat in the gallery, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as Anna was led into the courtroom. Their eyes met for a moment. Margaret searched for something in her expression. Recognition, regret, anger. What she saw was resignation. Not defeat, resignation. As if Anna had always known this ending was possible, perhaps inevitable. The proceedings were brief. Sentences were handed down with the understanding that prisoner exchanges were likely. Espionage cases rarely ended with long-term imprisonment. Margaret learned that Anna would probably return to the country she had served. What awaited her there, no one could say. After the trial, life did not return to normal. Margaret reopened the salon, but something fundamental had changed. She watched her clients more carefully now, not with suspicion, but with awareness. She noticed inconsistencies, hesitations, patterns. She did not accuse, she simply observed. The innocence that had once made trust effortless was gone. At home, she struggled with sleep. She replayed conversations from the past, words she had spoken freely,
stories she had shared. She wondered what had been genuine, whether any part of her friendship with Anna had been real. Morrison visited her one evening. He brought coffee and did not rush the conversation. "I know this wasn't easy," he said, "and I know it didn't end cleanly." Margaret asked the question that had haunted her since the arrest. Was any of it real? Morrison considered his answer carefully. "People like her are trained to compartmentalize," he said, "but they're still human. It's possible she felt something genuine. It just couldn't come before her mission." Margaret nodded, though the answer brought little comfort.
In the months that followed, newspapers published analyses of the case. Experts debated how the network had gone undetected for so long. Congressional hearings examined failures and vulnerabilities. Procedures were reviewed. Policy suggested. The Cold War continued. Margaret received a letter from the FBI director. It was formal, brief. It thanked her for her cooperation and vigilance. She placed it in a drawer and did not read it again. Recognition felt strange, unnecessary. What she carried with her was not pride, it was understanding. She understood now that espionage was not confined to intelligence agencies and shadowy figures. It existed in ordinary places, in conversations, in routines, in trust. Years later, when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated again, Margaret thought often of Anna. She wondered whether she had returned to Moscow, whether she had been rewarded or punished, whether she ever thought about the hairdresser in Manhattan who had noticed something small and refused to ignore it. Margaret never learned the answers. The Cold War ended, at least officially, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but its legacy remained. For Margaret, it lived on in habits she could not unlearn, in the way she listened, and in the way she watched. She eventually sold silken scissors and moved to a smaller apartment. She spent more time with her daughter and grandchildren. She rediscovered pleasures that did not involve vigilance. But she never forgot the lesson the hidden war had taught her, that history does not always announce itself, that it often moves quietly, through ordinary loves, and that sometimes the most consequential acts are not performed by those in power, but by people who notice something out of place and choose not to look away. The red passport that fell onto a salon floor on an unremarkable afternoon had unraveled years of careful deception. Not because Margaret was trained, not because she was searching for danger, but because she noticed what others were willing to ignore. And in the silent conflict of the Cold War, that was sometimes enough.